To the distinguished guests joining us today, including United Nations Secretary General's Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, Ms. Alice Wairimu Nderitu, and welcome to our expert panelists and all of you who are participating and watching this launch event online. My name is Felice Gaer, and I direct the American Jewish Committee's Jacob Blaustein Institute for the Advancement of Human Rights. For more than 50 years, the Jacob Blaustein Institute has been at the forefront of advancing international legal standards to protect human rights and prevent genocide, and promoting their implementation in practice. Today's event will launch a new United Nations policy document prepared by the UN Office of Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect in collaboration with our Jacob Blaustein Institute. The new policy guidance is entitled Combating Holocaust and Genocide Denial, Protecting Survivors, Preserving Memory, and Promoting Prevention. It responds to concerns and suggestions made at an expert brainstorming meeting on the subject of Holocaust and genocide denial, convened by the Jacob Blaustein Institute at the Special Advisor's request several months ago on Human Rights Day, 2021. There, a group of esteemed experts, including several of the speakers joining us today, the group of esteemed experts shared observations and reflections on the disturbing rise of two related and troubling phenomena that we are seeing around the world. First, Holocaust denial and distortion, and second, denial of the fact of genocides and other atrocity crimes that have been recognized by international tribunals. Now, the Jacob Blaustein Institute's interest in these issues is longstanding. For years, our institute worked with UN figures like the Special Advisors on Prevention of Genocide to identify human rights-related risk factors for genocide and human rights respecting responses to them. However, since 2017, we've been alarmed to see the evidence mounting that Holocaust denial and distortion are becoming increasingly common worldwide. We've seen narratives advanced in the context of populist and authoritarian discourse in several countries. We've seen populations' receptivity to Holocaust denial increase in response to the fear and insecurity that have accompanied the emergence of COVID-19's pandemic and its consequences. Now, we have called on UN system leaders, including those at headquarters, but also UN personnel in the field. We've called on UN system leaders to recognize that, like genocide denial, Holocaust denial is dangerous and must be challenged, not only because it advances anti-Semitic narratives and is harmful to victims of the Holocaust and their communities, but also because it encourages audiences to ascribe to other conspiracy theories and to engage with other forms of disinformation. This erodes the very foundations of cohesive, resilient societies. We are very grateful to Special Advisor Nderitu, whose own experiences led her to instinctively appreciate the danger of Holocaust denial, as well as the clear connection between it and the alarming genocide denial we are seeing today in countries like Bosnia-Herzegovina. This new UN policy document enables the United Nations leadership to communicate from the highest level that silence is not an option in the face of Holocaust denial and distortion and genocide denial, no matter where in the world these messages are being spread. Consistent with the Secretary General's plan of action on hate speech and with his call to action on human rights, the UN policy paper makes it clear that it is essential for United Nations actors and personnel to show solidarity with and to speak out publicly on behalf of groups that are being affected by Holocaust and genocide denial, even where it is politically challenging to do so. The policy paper calls on governments, politicians, faith leaders, educators, and social media companies to do their part to prevent and react effectively to the emergence of these harmful messages. Critically, the policy paper makes it clear that it is both possible and necessary for all stakeholders to take effective action to counter Holocaust denial and genocide denial, while protecting the right to freedom of expression. The paper distinguishes between permissible measures for combating Holocaust denial and impermissible so-called memory laws that aim to protect the reputation of states and that are being used actually to silence victims and advocates alike. In closing, I am grateful to Special Advisor Nderitu for her courage and her commitment in addressing this challenging subject. We look forward to working with her and her office and to promoting the implementation of this exceptional policy document throughout the United Nations system. Welcome, Special Advisor Nderitu. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Felice. I would like to begin by thanking you in the Jacob Blaustein Institute, especially because when we reached out to you, you received us with open arms, and we reached out to you with the worry of what we were seeing in regards to the consistency of Holocaust and genocide deniers, which had especially been given a lot of latitude by social media, because social media is especially efficient at disseminating information by Holocaust and genocide deniers. So I'd like to begin by saying that my mandate asks of me to be a catalyst, to raise awareness of causes, of dynamics about genocide, and to mobilize action to prevent. This policy document that we have now on combating Holocaust and genocide denial, protecting survivors, preserving memory, and promoting prevention is part of what I was put in this office to do, because we must counter Holocaust and genocide denial, and I'll tell you why. Because I do see from the work I was drawn from years I was mediating armed conflict, and I do see the need to translate from an intergenerational perspective that whole concept of prevention of atrocities as an international or national norm that can be implemented at all levels of society. We must be alive to the fact that we are living in a political climate that's marked by mainly the international community's inability to prevent divisions and therefore expected atrocities, and that we see increased privatization of security at the community level, including of vigilante groups. And we also see that we rely on the old and tried methods in which diplomatic efforts aimed at trust building are usually at the top political level. And so what is happening today as we launch this policy document constitutes one of the first attempts to synthesize old and new methods of knowledge on making the prevention of atrocities from the perspective of countering and taking head-on Holocaust and genocide deniers system-wide approach. So, and I would say that we've produced a very good document, but we must not only produce knowledge, we must also influence the directions the knowledge it takes after it's produced. So this new policy document contributes to combating Holocaust and genocide denial. And we know that there are several ways people have been working on combating Holocaust and genocide denial. And there are several judicial efforts. The Nuremberg courts, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, all of them have provided a significant contribution in terms of judgments that are based on proven facts beyond reasonable doubt and are therefore indispensable in conferring legitimacy on the fact of the happening of the Holocaust or the genocides against the Tutsi in Rwanda or in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And I would just like us to take a moment to reflect on the fact that we are here having a discussion, speaking about the Holocaust and the two genocides that have been proven in court, but deniers still persist. We do know that trials also preserve an accurate record of the crimes. And we do know that, for example, the Nuremberg trials, they've given the template for all these other trials that have happened that have made it extremely difficult for subsequent generations of Holocaust deniers to keep denying. So the evidence in all these trials is a really big obstacle to deniers, and we are grateful for that. And this evidence is both documentary and testimonies from victims. And this evidence also has really helped us to expose government efforts to misinform the public, but also it has also helped to expose state secrets. We know, for example, what was happening in the Holocaust was considered a state secret. And this is useful, but it's not enough because we are not yet unpacking. We haven't done enough to unpack what is this evidence that was brought before the Nuremberg trials. What is this evidence that was brought before the International Criminal Tribunal in Rwanda and the International Criminal Tribunal in the former Yugoslavia, unpacking it so that it's understood by the ordinary person who is not a lawyer or an academic. We do need to do much more of that. So we do know that Holocaust or genocides are presented by some deniers as an episode that happened in history or something that cannot be repeated. So this policy document that we are launching today speaks to the knowledge of the events around the Holocaust and genocides as systematic and bureaucratic and as murder that could happen again. So the Holocaust and genocides, again, I repeat, are some of the best documented events in history. Now, one of the things that worried me most about this, why we needed to do this, was seeing how Holocaust deniers have provided the template for genocide deniers. There have been spaces where Holocaust and genocide deniers have met in one room, holding conferences. They have written documents in which they cite each other, in essence, trying to build a body of knowledge on denial, in essence, trying to make it easy for anyone who hits the button searching for the Holocaust or for the genocides to go to find the information that they are putting out. So of course, we must counter them, and we must counter them with everything that we have, because they do assert that the genocides never happened. They dispute the figures of those killed. Yet we must accept that human beings have the capacity for both good and evil. And we must accept the Holocaust and genocide denial is motivated by hatred, and that it perpetuates stereotypes as well as minimizes victims of genocide. We see the pattern that we must counter. I was in Pittsburgh last year for the memory of the attack that happened in the Tree of Life synagogue. And we carefully went through the process that the killer prepared for. And part of it, of course, was all the deniers that he paid specific attention to work that had been done by Holocaust deniers. So in conclusion, as I thank everyone who is here today, I would like to say that Holocaust denial and genocide denial has become a unifying factor for all kinds of radical groups. And in much the way it has, what I have learned from the experience of mediating conflict is that the methods that are most used by those who plan for violence also become very efficient methods for those of us who work to counter them. So we will use their methods. We will counter them in all ways. We will use the cell phones that are in our hands. We will use the social media. We will use everything that we can work on, including scholarship. So we do know that there are deniers who debate this genocide also in that space of scholarship, and that we do know that the denial on the internet is a problem because of the speed of dissemination of information. So we do also have problems where we do not have laws against genocide and Holocaust denial. And I must say that because we do a lot of work with tech and social media companies, and it's one of the areas that we are going to pay specific attention to. And I'm grateful to the tech and social media companies we have engaged prior to the launch today, who have agreed that we are going to mount a campaign with them on countering Holocaust and genocide denial. Because we do understand that there are always root causes of the irrational behaviors that lead to genocide and Holocaust denial. And we do know for a fact that these events, no historian disputes that they exist. What they dispute the circumstances of their existence. So the UN has adopted 2 resolutions on Holocaust denial, one in 2007 and one in 2022. And I would like to quote specifically from one of them that says that denial of the Holocaust is it's itself tantamount to approval of genocide in all its forms. So I'd like to thank you once again, and very grateful that we are at this point of having put this document together and put it out now to the general public. Thank you.
Thank you, Special Advisor, and for these really important insights. We will now turn to our lineup of speakers. There'll be 4. And as you are listening to their initial remarks, I invite those of you who are joining us on Zoom to send questions in writing. Use the Q&A function on your screen, Q&A, and we'll pose the questions to our 4 distinguished panelists later in the event. Now, our first panelist is Professor Yuval Shany. He holds the Hersch Lauterpacht Chair in Public International Law at the Faculty of Law at Hebrew University. He is a former chair and member of the United Nations Human Rights Committee, the premier treaty body, and he participated in the expert brainstorming meeting that informed this policy paper. Yuval, welcome.
Thank you, Felice. And I want to thank the organizers for holding this important event. I also want to congratulate the Special Advisor on Prevention of Genocide and the Jacob Blaustein Institute for producing this important and timely report, which would no doubt help UN bodies, states, civil society groups, businesses, and other stakeholders to review their policy on this sensitive and difficult topic. The report is written against the reality of extensive use of online media for the dissemination of conspiracy theories, including denial of genocide, such as the Jewish Holocaust, and dissemination of other forms of disinformation, including distortion of genocides, which may involve their trivialization, as we have recently seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, or even justification. There is little need to underscore the harm caused by such a discourse. It re-victimizes past victims. It constitutes a form of hate speech against minority groups, adding insult to injury, namely that also adding the libel that they are liars, manipulators of the truth, and in control of international media to other negative stereotypes. And it may set the stage, as the report suggests, for the commission of future genocides, diluting the never again message, and undermining international justice mechanisms. Now, the link which the report draws between such harm pathologies and the need to advance a suitable digital literacy is very important. And I would suggest that further links should be built to the obligations of online platforms under instruments such as the recent EU Digital Services Act that requires companies to develop and enforce policies against hate speech and disinformation. More broadly, the seriousness of the harm and the seriousness of the risk of genocide requires a re-evaluation or a fine-tuning of the traditional stance of human rights bodies, including the Human Rights Committee against memory laws. This position has been reflected in General Comment 34 of 2011 of the Human Rights Committee. Whereas criminalizing speech, even false speech, remains a problematic and an exceptional tool, largely governed by the very specific terms of Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The threshold laid out in other legal tools, such as civil defamation laws, and more specifically, online content moderation laws, in order to protect the rights and others, the rights and reputations of others could be and should be somewhat lower, as viral dissemination of offensive speech on an unprecedented speed, scale, and scope goes far beyond the legitimate expectations of freedom of expression that are protected by Article 19. And an editorial-like intervention, when extremely offensive information is flagged by AI or user complaints, resulting in flagging, counter-messaging, the escalation of virality, the indexing or demoting of offensive sites, and in clear-cut cases, even content removal, is not only an acceptable content moderation policy, it should be the standard, where the protected interest is not the national or historical narrative, but rather past and future harm to past and future victims through denial or distortion of genocides. The proposed recommendations that are found in the report, they are sound. They, in part, they are an application of the Rabat plan of action. They pay particular attention to the status of the speech maker. They're also compatible with a set of guidelines I was privileged to participate in the preparation of which, that is the IDI Yad Vashem 2019 guidelines on reducing hate speech that focus on the harm principle in shaping content moderation policies and on curbing speech on genocide denial or distortion that is intended and expected to re-victimize victims and their descendants. The report also touches on the sensitive issue of collective responsibility and strikes a delicate balance between the need not to punish individuals for the wrongdoings of some members of the group to which they belong, and on the other hand, the need to respond to dynamics of group support and acquiescence by members of the group going beyond the active conduct of direct perpetrators of atrocities. The guidelines do a good job in that regard in directing attention to systems that facilitate the commission of genocide, and such systems are certainly targets of legitimate criticisms, and they would be a highly suspect source of dissemination of information that would be offensive. I also note the report's allusion to the IHRA, to the IHRA standards for helping to guide the response to Holocaust denial. I think international acceptance of such a definition, like the international acceptance that the special advisor alluded to of historical facts by international tribunals, can help us in distinguishing between legitimate and illegitimate restrictions on denial of historical events. I also fully support and associate myself with the call in the report for stronger accountability and search for truth measures. Such measures are not only important per se, they are also important in regard to assist us, the stakeholders, in separating between legitimate and illegitimate responses to manifestations of historical denialism. I will stop here and cede back the floor to you, Felice. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Yuval. We will now hear from Dr. Robert Williams. Dr. Williams is the Deputy Director of International Affairs at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and he is chair of the IHRA project on Holocaust denial and distortion laws, which you've just heard about. He was also a participant in the expert brainstorming meeting that informed this policy paper. Rob, welcome.
Thank you, Felice. And my thanks as well to Special Advisor Nderitu, to the United Nations, and to the Jacob Blaustein Institute for asking me to weigh in today. Ms. Nderitu's vital policy paper is a stark reminder of the reality that denial and distortion of genocides are on the rise and go hand in glove with many other challenges that we face today. This is why so many of us are concerned by this phenomena. Major multilateral bodies like the United Nations or the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, as well as leading cultural institutions such as the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, focus on distortion and denial not just because they threaten our shared history, but because they undermine our hope for a more peaceable future built on mutual respect and the preservation of core liberties. I want to turn to what we mean by denial and distortion for just a moment, though. You see, denial is a claim that a genocide never happened. Let's take the case of the Holocaust as a paradigm. A Holocaust denier wants you to believe that the Holocaust never happened because they want to provide legitimacy for Nazism, or they want to make anti-Semitism acceptable. This means that Holocaust denial is anti-Semitism. Now, other forms of denial of genocide might have different motivations, but they all lead to the same basic outcomes: irrational and dangerous forms of bias. Distortion of genocide is a bit trickier. At the simplest level, it's an attempt to excuse, to minimize, to ignore, or otherwise misrepresent a genocide, either as something historical or as something that matters today. Consequently, distortion is both more common and more adaptable. And we often see both state and non-state actors using distortion as an intentional form of disinformation and propaganda. It's also difficult to identify the motives behind distortion. Is it a product of hate or a product of ignorance? In many ways, it doesn't matter. Think of it this way. On a moral level, distortion insults the memories and victims and survivors of atrocities. On a practical level, distortion is a gateway to conspiracy theory, to outright denial of past crimes, and to violent extremism. Special Advisor Nderitu addresses these risks in her document, as well as in her opening statement, by noting that distortion and denial can generate fear among survivors and inspire future acts of aggression. How does this work in practice? Well, denial and distortion have many forms, including attempts to turn the perpetrators of past crimes into national or communal heroes. Other forms include efforts to minimize or excuse violence, to justify it through the creation of new conspiracy theories, or even at times to blame the victims. Sometimes, as we've seen during the COVID pandemic, it's taken the form of the cynical misuse of imagery and themes associated with genocides. Other times, actors may simply distort the past in order to insult or to extort, or even use it as a pretext to launch attacks against communities, peoples, and countries. And this is a global problem. No nation seems to be immune from it. And more disturbing, perhaps, we've seen similar patterns in the past. You see, the denial and distortion of history is an old tool. It's a tool that generates uncertainty and the conditions under which people begin questioning the value of truth. If truth no longer matters, then we're going to lose faith in our core institutions. We're going to forgive and forget our civil and human rights, and we're going to put aside the need to have healthy relationships with one another. And how have people responded at such moments? Often enough, by seeking comfort in shared fantasies of chauvinistic national glory that only lead to more tension within and outside national borders. As history has shown, such conditions are just a breeding ground for racial and ethnic violence. It's also important to remember that today's distortion and denial is more than just an attempt to create a convenient or comfortable history. It often accompanies other efforts to recreate the politics, the social cultural norms, and the prejudices of eras that witnessed incredible suffering and strife. So what do we do? Ms. Nderitu's recommendations, based as they are on dialogue and pre-existing UN agreements, can help illuminate a pathway out of our current predicament. Governments have a responsibility to do more, that's for sure, but to do so honestly, they and we must recognize the uniqueness of each genocide, the particular experiences of those affected by these mass crimes, and not allow individual genocides to be misused as tools of propaganda. We must recognize as well, as you, Felice, mentioned a moment ago, that there are efforts to obscure understanding of genocide at official levels, oftentimes through the passage of so-called memory laws, laws that ultimately can bar scholars, journalists, and others from engaging honestly with history. These laws, under certain conditions, can lead to new, sometimes government-sanctioned forms of denial and distortion that only harms relations between states and mars the legacy and memory of victims and survivors. New media is also a major factor. Just as social media companies must shoulder certain obligations, we also have a responsibility. Namely, we need to learn how to better recognize and communicate against distortion. For this, education will be essential. Excellent resources exist, but more needs to be done. We also have to resist the temptation to separate the history of genocides from our common experience. Genocides are part of our shared narrative. Whether our forebears were perpetrators, victims, liberators, or bystanders, genocide and atrocity are part of our global history. There's so much more work to do, but Special Advisor Nderitu's efforts, as well as those by the UN as a whole, can help us establish a right footing. So we applaud the release of this report, and we hope for its broad implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you for your leadership on the IHRA definition and its working group regarding Holocaust denial. We'll now hear from Dr. Alexandra Glaszinska-Grabias, who is an assistant professor at the Poznan Human Rights Center of the Institute of Law Studies and the Polish Academy of Sciences, and who also participated in the expert brainstorming meeting that informed the new policy paper. Alexandra, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Felice. I would like first to join previous speakers, previous panelists, in thanking and congratulating both the Special Advisor and the Jacob Blaustein Institute for drafting this this policy paper, for preparing it, and also for gathering us today. And I consider the policy paper to be a very courageous and important tool and a huge step forward in our common way towards combating Holocaust and genocide denial and distortion. Why I think it's courageous? Because it doesn't avoid tackling and addressing the most difficult challenges that accompany this fight against this phenomenon of denial and distortion. And most importantly, it underlines the need to seek balance between legal prohibitions and bans of such denial and distortion, and guarantees, securing the guarantees of freedom of expression that are very deeply embedded in international human rights law. And as Rob mentioned, it's extremely important, in particular in case of Holocaust or genocide distortion, that is not as evident example as the denial of these crimes is. But today I would like to indicate and concentrate perhaps on four core and most crucial aspects that are addressed in policy paper, but which are also very important in the general consideration of the problem we are discussing and the policy paper is addressing. So first, there is a need to acknowledge the hateful, hatred, and violence inciting potential or element in denial and distortion. And these are most often not ordinary usual words, but these are words that easily turn into deeds and should be seen and perceived as an element of the whole circle of steps that can lead to another genocide. And I think that acknowledging this hateful element and situating Holocaust or genocide denial and distortion within the context of hate speech and violence incitement is extremely important. And thus the proper classification and identification of denial and distortion is extremely important too. Then second, there is an obligation to enforce and implement binding laws that concern Holocaust and genocide distortion and denial. And if such provisions are ignored and not respected, as it happens in many states, then the social consequences can be extremely negative, as a signal is being then given to the societies that actually denying and distorting historical truth concerning the atrocities, former atrocities, is actually accepted by the state. So this is, again, extremely important to address the issue of implementation of the laws that are already in force. Then the third point that I think it's worth mentioning and raising is the urgent need to conduct systemic trainings for judges, prosecutors, other representatives of legal professions, law enforcement agencies, etc., on the trainings on the legal aspects of Holocaust and genocide denial and distortion. And the policy paper mentions this training aspect as well. And I think that such trainings should amount to this obligatory part of more general professional trainings within legal professional area. So this conclusion also and recommendation appears in almost all reports and surveys conducted within this field, and this is high time national authorities take it seriously. And my last point, very important also for me personally, as I come from Poland and deal a lot with Central Eastern Europe, is this subtle form of genocide or other atrocities, mostly distortion, because not perhaps a pure denial, that is being very often hidden behind the phenomenon of the so-called memory loss that you, Felice, mentioned in the introduction to our session today. So the policy paper recognizes the more and more attractive, I would say, for many national authorities, way of imposing their desired vision of the past and history, and turning it into binding laws with the use of memory loss in particular. And very often, these national authorities even bring the example of Holocaust denial laws as an excuse or explanation of why they need their own laws of this kind. And this is, as I said, particularly visible trend in Central and Eastern European states, and mostly in relation to the Holocaust past and history and attitudes of particular nations of the region, but also Baltic states and nations a lot towards Jewish community before, during, and right after Second World War. So the danger of such distortion presented in the forms of this kind of memory loss is painfully real. It leads historians to the courtrooms where they face charges, for example, for the defamation of the good name of the nation and the state. But it also allows for a more general phenomenon of rewriting history that can serve as justification for crime and aggression. The current examples of what's happening in the world actually manifest and prove. So I think that this aspect of the policy paper is one of the most important ones in the sense of our future steps and strategies towards counteracting genocide and Holocaust distortion and protecting historical truth, as I find it as one of the most important elements of the whole process of acting against genocide, distortion, and denial. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra, for that important 4-point summary of the policy paper and warnings about the future. Our final speaker is Mr. Fabian Salvioli. Fabian is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-recurrence. He is also a professor of international law and human rights at the School of Law at the University of La Plata, where he directs the university's Institute of Human Rights. He recently carried out an official United Nations country visit to Bosnia-Herzegovina in his capacity as Special Rapporteur. And we're looking forward to him presenting the report of that visit to the Human Rights Council soon. Special Rapporteur Salvioli, welcome.
Thank you very much, dear Felice. Let me first of all to thank you for the invitation and to congratulate the special advisor and the Jacob Blaustein Institute because this policy paper is really a very good tool for all of us. I guess is a point of depart for rethink how we are working in this very delicate and sensitive issue. And in this regard, let me first of all to express my solidarity with the victims of the Holocaust, with the families of the victims of all crimes against humanity around the world. Of course, the paper is really interesting to me because the paper provides us very good tools for addressing the issue of denial of genocide and the distortion of crimes against humanity. And one thing that I really appreciate is the remark on memory. As you know, I presented a report in 2019 to the Human Rights Council about memory as a fifth pillar of a transitional justice process. And that is very important because memorialization processes inside the warranties of non-recurrences were a little bit invisible. So it is fundamental for me to think that truth, justice, reparations, warranties of non-recurrences, and memorialization are interlinked, and the state must fulfill the obligations in regard to all these 5 pillars, but not just states, also the treaty bodies and other international bodies. Our role as monitors of the obligations of the state. And I guess perhaps we are failing. We are failing in our task. So we should to rethink our task. First of all, these are obligations, duties to the state. It's not political will. The state must fulfill these obligations. It's the obligation to protect the warranty. And I think we should to use all the machinery of human rights. Frankly, when the Human Rights Committee addressed the Rabbi case, unfortunately, I was in the minority. And I think the committee did not address the issue in a proper manner about discrimination and hate speech. And it is true that hate speech is perhaps very difficult to in order to prove. But why not think in other tools to combat discrimination and to combat the violation of the right to integrity? For me, denial of genocide or distortion of genocide is a violation of human rights, is an inhuman treatment, and perhaps the next step of the monitoring bodies should move in that direction. Also, I would like to say that it is fundamental to have accountability. One of the problems about atrocity crimes is impunity. So I'm very happy with the paper because you address the issue of accountability in my opinion, in a proper manner. And again, I presented a report. My last report to the Human Rights Council was on accountability. But accountability itself is not enough. So the fifth pillar must be fulfilled by the government, by the state. And the example of Bosnia you highlighted, dear Felice, is clear. Is clear. I'm very, very, very concerned because some war criminals are considered now heroes by the population. And that is because perhaps the problem was the failure in terms of memorialization processes. So I am on board with you. I am on board with the idea to work together. And I hope with the special rapporteur, we will produce, that's my idea, and I shared with her in New York last year. Perhaps we can produce a joint report about memorialization and prevention of genocide. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Fabian, and for those important comments on memory as a fifth pillar and the need for memorialization and more work in this area. We will now move on to a brief question and answer period. If you have questions and you'd like to pose, please, again, use the Q&A function. I'm going to give the floor to Kristen Broker. Kristen is Deputy Director of the Jacob Blaustein Institute and was JBI's project director and leader on this policy paper. She will present a few questions that have been received, and I'm happy to yield the floor to Kristen Broker.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to hear from our speakers today. We've received several questions that I'm going to try to summarize very quickly. First, Professor Shany, you discussed the need to reflect within the human rights community about recalibrating the understanding of when denial speech is harmful and when restrictions can be legitimately imposed. How can this understanding be reached without inadvertently condoning some of the harmful speech that Professor Glasinska-Grabius spoke about, and rather open the door for condoning the use of memory laws that are too broad in their application and that are so harmful around the world? And Professor Glasinska-Grabius, if you could address that question as well. A question was posed about social media companies. Have they not already recognized that Holocaust denial is harmful speech? What more needs to be done to affect the way that those platforms are dealing with such speech? And what role should the UN play in advancing those goals? To all panelists, are there specific examples of the sort of training and instruction that you mentioned having a positive impact on authorities in countries where Holocaust and genocide denial and distortion are occurring and increasing their ability to effectively deal with these challenges? And finally, a general question about the UN's response to various instances of atrocities around the world. What should the UN's role be in determining that statements do constitute harmful denial and not legitimate historical inquiry, or vice versa? How should UN staff be expected to arbitrate between such truth claims? These are challenging questions, and we'll give each panelist about 90 seconds to respond to whatever aspect you would like. We'll begin. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Kristen. So 90 seconds each. We'll begin with Mr. Salvioli.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question. I would like to address the last one. I guess it is important and it's one of my favorite issues. So one of the problems I see in the UN system is that it's not a system. And perhaps we have different approach. So when I was member of the Human Rights Committee, I shared the committee with my dear colleague Yuval, Shany, and he was chair also of the committee. I was shocked because special rapporteurs with common issues never came to us when we examine reports of the states. So I have been in a Human Rights Committee with my new hat, as a special rapporteur. And if we give different message to the states and to the society, that's confused. And it's confusing also for the victims, and perhaps we are not working in a proper manner. So I guess we should react as a system, but in which line? With the most protective approach. All treaty bodies, all organs, all special procedures should be open to more progressive approach in order to protect human rights. And sometimes we are not enough open arms. And that's a problem for a victim. So that's my reflection on the last question that I think it is very important. Thank you, Felice.
Thank you. We now turn to Dr. Glushinska-Grabias for 90 seconds.
Thank you. Well, addressing the question concerning memory loss, well, the answer is complicated as always, because there are, of course, different kinds of memory loss, and there is a huge group or category of memory loss that have been implemented and drafted and implemented with, so to say, good intentions, and really in order to acknowledge the suffering of victims and protect their dignity, and also to safeguard historical truth. And such laws also appear in, for the example I gave, the Central Eastern Europe, that wants to have their own historical past, their Eastern European past, acknowledged by other regions of the world. So we cannot say in general that memory laws are just the attempts to whitewash history, or that they are in general in violation of human rights protection standards, in particular freedom of speech or academic speech. But we have to look carefully and assess them exactly in accordance with the standards, with constitutional law standards of national states and international human rights protection standards. We have to be really careful when such laws are being used, or rather abused, as tools or weapons in political or ideological fights that a lot of states or authorities of the states are engaged in. And very briefly on the state's attitude towards the issue of distortion and the denial, again, it's complicated and it differs widely among the states. I think that an extremely important element also of the policy paper, and perhaps a recommendation of what to do next, would be to have a series of meetings with the representatives of the governments and national authorities, introducing the report to them, and underlining their obligations arising from international law that are also tackled in the policy paper. So that would be my responses to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we turn the floor to Dr. Rob Williams.
So I'll take up the 90-second challenge and try to answer 3. I'll start with the social media question. You know, some social media companies have taken vigorous efforts to deal with these issues, but it's important to remember that this is also a problem of volume. So in the amount of time that I have just spoken, 500 videos have been posted to YouTube, 510,000 comments on Facebook, 136,000 photos on Facebook, and that's just in 60 seconds. So dealing with that volume is a challenge on those open platforms. But we also have closed platforms like Telegram, and we have image boards like 8kun that are very, very difficult to monitor. More work needs to be done, and it has to be a joint effort. On the question of how the UN can arbitrate these issues, well, I'm going to speak as an historian here. I don't want the UN arbitrating the past. The UN is not qualified to do that. That is the work of scholars. What the UN can do, however, is create awareness, to create structures so that civil society efforts and governmental efforts can work in cooperation in order to suss out the fact versus the fiction of the past and to move together in a healthy, peaceable manner. And then the question concerning success stories. Well, I could begin with the US, British, and French occupation of Germany and the programs that were put in place there to help the German people come to a reckoning with their past. I could also bring it to the early 2000s and discuss international commissions that were built in the country of Romania to help Romanians overcome some governmental reluctance to deal with issues like the Holocaust. But we don't have time for that. What I will say is those success stories were built on international cooperation, whether it was bilateral US-German cooperation or cooperation between multilateral organizations and specific governments. They were built on cooperation between states, and they also had governmental buy-in. The Germans would never have acknowledged the Holocaust to the degrees they do if the German government, specifically the West German government as it existed at the time, had not taken efforts to bring things forward, and if German civil society had not, from the ground up, tried to build a reckoning with the past. But there are some success stories we could build from. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now turn to Professor Shany.
Yes, thank you. So on the issue of recalibration of policies, I draw again attention of listeners to the standards I've alluded to before, the Yad Vashem IDI guidelines. They have a provision, recommendation 3, which deals specifically with trying to separate legitimate from illegitimate intervention with respect to memory laws. And the relevant sentence goes like this: when denial of clearly established historical facts about the most serious international crimes, such as the Holocaust and other past genocides, is intended and expected to re-victimize victims and their descendants, it should be considered a harmful form of speech. I should say that there are 2 elements here which are important. First, what is the intent of the speaker? And that goes back also to the Rabat Plan of Action. Is it about protecting a national narrative? And there I think there would be strong reservations about curbing speech. Or is it about protecting victims, actual victims, from being re-victimized? And are we talking about clearly established facts, namely facts, for instance, that have been established by international accountability mechanisms? So these are not perfect categories, but I think they would give some important guidance to policymakers. I should note that the context we were dealing with was not a context of a criminal law, but rather content moderation policies of online platforms. I would also note with regard, and with this I would conclude, with regard to the online platforms, it's true that, as Rob just said, some have changed their policies, not all, some have, but still there are huge issues concerning enforcement. There are questions about circumvention of the rules by using all sorts of code words that would convey the same message without actually directly clashing with the rules. And there is also a problem of coordinating between different policy silos. So the hate speech silo, the disinformation silo, and the call for violence silo for many companies are not well synchronized, and there are many cracks, many gaps between the policies through which offensive speech can be disseminated. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I just want to not only thank all of the speakers, but to point out that the policy paper is a link to it is available in the chat if you would like. It's a public document. It's available anywhere. Remember its title, Protecting Survivors, Preserving Memory, and Promoting Prevention. It's now my honor to give the floor back to Special Advisor Nderitu for final words and to close our meeting.
Thank you very much, Felice, and thank you to all of us for this wonderful conversation today, very deep insights. And I'd first like to say that we just came from the month of June, where several events happened. I had several opportunities to speak about Holocaust and genocide to international audiences. And the first ever commemoration of the International Day for Countering Hate Speech took place on 18th June, 2022. And it was made possible by a General Assembly Resolution 75/309, and which was adopted by consensus on 21st July, 2021. So this means that going forward, every 18th June 2022 will now be observed annually as the International Day for Countering Hate Speech. And since this resolution invites member states, organizations, and the UN, as well as international, regional organizations, civil society, everybody, private sector, to observe the International Day for Countering Hate Speech, it gives us a very good space for launch date, space for having a conversation around what it means in regard to countering Holocaust and genocide now. And I would also like to draw your attention to the policy guidance, an earlier policy guidance from my office, which defines hate speech. And we know, of course, hate speech doesn't have a universal common definition, but the UN definition of hate speech is, we define hate speech as any kind of communication in speech, writing, or behavior that attacks or uses pejorative or discriminatory language with reference to a person or a group on the basis of who they are. In other words, based on their religion, ethnicity, nationality, race, color, descent, gender, or other identity factor. So clearly, Holocaust and genocide denial is hate speech. So we had this high-level informal meeting of the General Assembly convened by the President of the General Assembly, where we discussed hate speech for the very first time in the history of the UN. We had a conversation by all member states presenting on what they are doing on hate speech in their countries. And I framed the conversation, because I was representing the Secretary General at this event, I framed the conversation around Holocaust and genocide denial as part of his speech. And then I also briefed the Security Council on 21st June on incitement to violence leading to atrocity crimes. And again, when speaking to the Security Council, I recall the Holocaust, the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, the genocide in Srebrenica in 1995. And I reminded the Security Council that not only is incitement to violence and denial of the Holocaust and genocides, not only do they pose a threat to peace and security, human rights, they also pose a threat to sustainable development. So I would say that this is something that's picking up traction, and that's in response to one of the questions I saw in the chat box about the states. Are we speaking to the states? Yes, we are. We've communicated in writing, and we are going to send this document, this policy document, to all countries in the world, to all member states in the world. We shall send this document officially and begin the engagement around this document. Then the other thing I wanted to make a point on was on tech and social media companies, and that they've already acknowledged that Holocaust denial should not be allowed. I would say that not all of them have, and when they have, they've done so, but then there are quite a number of ways that have just been described in terms of the volume, the speed, first of all, of dissemination, but also the fact that tech and social media companies have spread their wings as fast as possible because they were created to engage. So they spread their wings as fast as possible to places where they don't have translation for languages. So we have them so when we talk about them acknowledging that Holocaust denial is a problem and taking down posts, for example, on Holocaust denial, it means that they're only taking down posts in the languages that they can understand, that they have translation for. But the other thing we've learned from, because we've engaged for a very long time with tech and social media companies. We have these Chatham House rule meetings with them because we realized like talking to them was not working. We need to sit with them and tell them, I keep telling them that the key reason we meet is because their business model is completely, it hurts what I'm trying to do every day. It promotes all the kind of things that we try to fight against. So emojis, they are not able, they are algorithms that they've put in place to capture certain words. They don't capture emojis. They don't capture pictures in many occasions, and videos. YouTube has quite a number of these denialists, quite a number of them. And also, in many cases, when people are speaking about what they want to do in terms of harming the victims and survivors of the Holocaust and the genocides, they do not say directly that we shall go out and kill, these people. They use metaphors, they use proverbs, which everybody who is reading understands exactly what they mean, but it can't be proven. So when you say, like, for example, in Rwanda, we are going to cut the tall trees, or for the Rohingya, it was, we shall go and we need to remove the fleas from our bodies, our clothes. We need to, all these kind of metaphors that you hear, then cannot be captured. So there's a huge amount of work to be done with tech and social media companies. I've seen the question in the chat box on what we are doing about Tigray. We've been supporting the African Union efforts through President Obasanjo, given huge amounts of support. I issued several statements that made it very clear that what we were saying in Ethiopia bore the marks of genocidal character. And I spoke about all sides in terms of what everybody was doing to each other. And at the moment, we are putting wind in the sails of the fact-finding commission that was set up by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And in terms of this, what to do, what are we going to do going forward? We will work with Felice to translate this document into a teaching tool. We would like to make it easy for example, for a teacher who needs to design a lesson plan around how to teach Holocaust and genocide denial, to teach this document. We would like to make that easy for them. The other thing that we are doing is that we've had a meeting with of prosecutors. I speak a lot to those people who've prosecuted Nuremberg and the genocide in Bosnia-Herzegovina and against the Tutsis in Rwanda. And we are planning a meeting in Nuremberg for the prosecutors, but also for the victims and survivors, because we have to first strengthen them so that they know each other. I was surprised when I went to Rwanda and I kept talking about Bosnia-Herzegovina and the denialists and the commonalities and the fact that the celebration of as Fabian has said, how these perpetrators are being celebrated as heroes. Their murals are everywhere, billboards. And I've talked I was explaining to the people in Rwanda that I went to Serbia, where the genocide itself did not even happen in Serbia, but there was a big mural of Ratko Mladic, and people the country was so divided around whether that mural should be up or not. And talking to people in Rwanda about what happened in Bosnia-Herzegovina, I felt the disconnect, that they didn't seem to know a lot about it. And the same thing in Bosnia-Herzegovina, there doesn't seem to be that huge amount of knowledge. But then there are prosecutors who are able, because of precedents, judicial officers rely on precedents. So then there are a space that we can work with in terms of having this conversation. So we are going to Nuremberg next year. We have somebody who prosecuted the Nuremberg trials. He's 100 years old now, and we hope that he hosts us for this meeting that we need to have of champions of prevention from post-genocidal societies. And as I come to an end, I would also like to say that in terms of this whole campaign on genocide and Holocaust denial, the speaker who said that the UN's role is to create awareness was absolutely right. And we have huge amount of work to do around that. And going forward, one of the things that my office has authority to do is to issue public statements that provide visibility to victims and survivors. I have made it a policy that I am not going to say anything in any speech that I make, and in any given week, I make about 3 speeches. I speak to audiences all over the world, that I will not make any single speech without mentioning Holocaust and genocide denial. I will do it every time I speak. And then at the same time, I'm going to do lots of work on advocacy on the importance of criminal accountability and the acknowledgement of victim suffering as 2 like parallel dimensions that do require attention, because sometimes we forget to acknowledge victim suffering. And my final word is what I told the mothers of Srebrenica. I told them that one of the things that concerns me so hugely in the position that I sit as a special advisor on the prevention of genocide as Under Secretary General is how often we, the world, leave it to the victims and the survivors of the Holocaust and of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda and in Bosnia-Herzegovina to be the ones to put them through new pain. Not only were they not victims or survivors, but they have to be the ones to defend that this actually happened to them. And that this is something that we need to build a whole critical mass of people to take this and support them, take this burden from them. It cannot be that they went through what they went through. The mothers of Srebrenica, for instance, endured years and years of testifying in courts, witnessing, reliving what happened to their children and their relatives. And then, as if that's not enough, when the genocide is denied, they are the ones who still have to stand up and say, this genocide actually happened. And if we are to do anything, if I am to do anything in this office, really, it's to take away that burden from people who've suffered so much and who continue to suffer so much from hearing the Holocaust denied, from hearing the genocide in Srebrenica and against the Tutsi in Rwanda denied. So on that note, I would like to really appreciate all of you, most of all Felice and your team, Christine, Felice, thank you so much. And much appreciation to Simona, who we work with, because Felice, Simona, Christina, myself, the 4 of us, it was because of the momentum of the meetings that we had, just the 4 of us, that have led us to this point. And of course, now we have all these friends and partners who've come on board. And we really appreciate all of you. And we ask that you disseminate this document as far as you can and to as many people as you can. Thank you very much.